Hello, everyone. My name is David Podine. I'm a partner here at Haber Law in Miami, Florida. We have a great webinar for you today about COVID vaccines, community association, liability, rules, new executive orders, what currently exists and where this whole mess is going. I'm joined by my partner here at Haber Law, Jonathan Goldstein, often referred to as the condo professor. He is board certified in community law. And we are also joined by Raphael from Affinity Management. Why don't you both say hello and give a quick intro?
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Raphael, and your team at Affinity Management, for joining us for this webinar on vaccine issues for associations. Like David said, I'm chair of the Community Association Department at Haber Law and board certified in Condominium and Plan Development Law. Raphael, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and Affinity Management?
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, David, for having me here today. I want to thank your team as well for putting together the webinar. We're really looking forward to this topic. It's early on, but we're starting to get the questions. So it's important for us to start sharing this knowledge. While it will be difficult for either Haber Law to take a position or Affinity, this is all new to us. We want to take this opportunity to just really chit chat of what's going on, what we're seeing, what we believe certain approaches could be, or what some recommendations for your board of directors. For myself, my name is Raphael Aquino. I am the CEO and co-founder of Affinity Management Services. We are an association management company that services both Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. So thank you all for being here today. I applaud you for taking time out of your day. For those board members and for those managers, I applaud you as well for taking the time to gain some additional information and further get more knowledge on how to deal with this COVID crisis that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and David, if I could just add one more thing. Basically, this is a really interesting topic that's going to have controversy involved. The issue of vaccines and whether associations can require vaccines. I just want to emphasize, we represent condominiums and HOAs throughout South Florida, and in some cases throughout the state for litigation. And none of the things we say today, we're going to talk about a lot of issues, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're advocating for that particular position. You know what I mean? We're not, just because we talk about the pros and cons or the arguments in favor or against something, doesn't mean we're sitting here saying, here, you should do this, or we're in favor of this. Please don't mistake it for that, because this is a really interesting topic and controversial. So, please just, take it that way. It's not legal advice. It's just helpful information to guide managers and directors and members who are very curious about, these developing issues.
Thank you. And I think we have a chat function that we'll try to save some time so we can get some Q&A chat, so I'll be mindful of that. So to kick it off here, I first want to go to Jonathan. I want to ask about the governor's recent executive order, and sort of related to that point, but I also want to hear from Raphael in terms of just what's going on with your teammates, your managers, your properties. You've been at this, for 13 months now. Crazy to say. It's April 14th. Just to sort of get the eyes and ears from management on sort of where, to the extent you can say generally, where the properties are with their COVID journey, for lack of a way to put it.
So I guess to start, the issues we're talking about involve whether associations can mandate vaccines, what the practical implications of that would even be, how it might even be considered, what the issues with that are, et cetera. And of course, from a management perspective, Raphael will discuss, the administration of that and issues relating to that, how managers are dealing with this, their dynamics. And before we even go into this topic, it's an interesting dynamic that just recently the governor of Florida entered an executive order that deals with this very topic, because it is something that's on the horizon that everybody's wondering about. And so And the governor dealt with it more generally in the topic, in the context of vaccine passports, right? This topic, not just in condominium associations, but throughout Florida, of whether people can be prohibited from going places or doing things because they don't have a card or some proof that they've been vaccinated. And so the governor dealt with it in a very broad way. And it's not necessarily targeted to associations, and it may not even govern associations. But so this executive order from the governor, which was executed on April 2nd, it basically, and again, we'll go into it in more detail, but to simplify it, businesses in Florida are prohibited from requiring patrons or customers to provide any documentation certifying COVID-19 vaccination or post-transmission recovery to gain access to, entry upon, or service from the business. And we can like parse that language, you know, with a magnifying glass to talk about its significance for condos. But it also talks about how businesses have to comply to be eligible for grants or contracts funded through state revenue. And it emphasizes the right to privacy for medical information as a basis for not requiring people to show proof of vaccination. And again, you know, not to get political or comment on it one way or the other from a political point of view, right or wrong, you know, from our standpoint, I think there's a significant question of whether it applies to condos. Because that, before we even talk about whether condos can require vaccines, we have to address whether the governor has forbidden it. And reading the language, there's reasonable minds can differ. You know, we participate in listservs with other condo attorneys. You hear different emails from the different, you know, professionals. I won't speak for any of them specifically, but suffice it to say, it's not like there's a consensus on this. People have different thoughts. This doesn't apply to condos. This may apply to condos. Condos are businesses. Condos don't have patrons or customers. You know, there's a lot of different opinions, and it's a real question mark whether this even applies to condos.
There's even an opinion that the governor's order, even if you say, okay, it's a not-for-profit corporation, that's a business, it's under 617, which is the Corporations Act, it says that failure to comply with the order results in lack of state funding or state contract. So some people might say, and again, we're presenting these issues in terms of to present both sides. Hypothetically, some people might say, who cares? Raphael, none of your condos get state funding or have state contract. You know, it's one thing
right.
if you're a highway cone rental company and you're doing big contracts with the state of Florida and Department of Transportation, you say, you know, I don't want to lose my state of Florida contract, but you know, the average condominium association in Miami might think, well, what are the consequences of not following? So with that said, I think, Jonathan, that's a great summary in terms of this executive order recently came out, number one. Number two, there's a debate within the condo legal community association or legal community about what does this apply, and even if it does apply, what are the consequences for not following it? So we'll put a pin in that. We could go on forever just about this recent executive order, but we wanted to make sure to touch on it time. Like I said earlier, Raphael, can you just give us like a little bit, as much as you can, sort of like, you know, what you're seeing and hearing from your teammates, the people that are doing all the great work on the field, your managers, your on-site staff. You know, you guys manage properties in Miami-Dade and Broward, and I think you even told me Palm Beach as well. So, you know, can you give us a perspective on the managing side?
Sure, most definitely, David. You know, what we've seen, it's a little bit different than what we saw about a year ago. You know, fortunately enough, over the past couple of months, we've realized that, you know, most board members have appreciated now our employees more than ever. They've realized, you know, not just from the management perspective, but also from let's say, from the legal perspective, where they understand how important it is to have these partnerships with the right vendors that can help you guide you through this process. As Jonathan said a little bit earlier, you know, it's very difficult to take a position because there's so many different ways that these things can be approached, as well as how they can be interpreted. But to be specific to the time of now, of how it's being managed now, it really depends, David, on the board of directors and how risk averse that they are. Obviously, we're making sure that our communities are following whatever the CDC guidelines are, depending on what county that we're in and what area. So those are being followed. However, you do have some board members that take the position that they still want to be a bit more strict, where they're still restricting the amount of residents that are going into the community. We're seeing that that's very minimal, especially the past couple of months. They've been reducing those restrictions. And it has to do because obviously a lot of residents, especially on the condo side, even though it does impact the HOA, where, you know, residents are just tired of being locked in, not being able to use their amenities, not being able to use the pool. Now we're coming into, you know, quote unquote, our summer. And, you know, residents want to be able to use their pools. So really, as from a management perspective, what we're doing is just providing the guidance and understanding of what we're seeing in the market. However, we're still heavily leaning with our attorneys because there's so many changes that are going on. As Jonathan mentioned with the executive order, you know, we're leaning strongly with our partners so that, you know, we can make sure that we're providing the guidance that's necessary so that the boards are making the proper business judgment rule. When it comes to the vaccine itself, again, it's so early on. We've really only had one client kind of ask the question of what happens if we did want to make a requirement. And again, it's still very early on for us. I think at this time, if that's something that the board wants to do, I think it's great to really have these conversations, because that's what's going to allow you to make better decisions. You know, a lot of people start, you know, it becomes very politicized. Oh, well, if you're taking this position, you're taking this side, and it becomes very politicized. But no, in business, you have to look at things, you have to analyze them, and then determine what's the best outcome for you and your community. You know, if you're not analyzing that, you may be missing out on something. It may not be the decision that you make, let's say to, hey, we want to require vaccination. But by having these conversations, you can open things up. You can start to understand what's the right direction, what's the right thing for your community, and you can make better decisions as a board rather than just either ignoring it or just taking one hard position.
Exactly. I think that's such a great point, and you touched on a couple of things that is always an important framework to view this situation. You know, a lot of times if people say condo law, then you can catch myself always saying condo and then saying, you know, community associations. You know, you really have to look at this on oftentimes a community by community basis, because your 50-story residential condo high-rise is much different than your 20-home HOA that really only has, you know, a private drive and a guardhouse and maybe a dog park. So that's always an important step back to say that, you know, not all property and projects are the same. So transitioning to the big question, which I like to put Jonathan on the spot with, but I won't directly, but I'll preview it a little bit. You know, can associations require vaccines? Now, I like to say, well, what do you mean by that question? Require vaccines of who? Of the employees? Does the association even have employees? Of the vendors? Or of the owners and residents? Or guest invitees? So I see these as separate buckets. Some can be more easily addressed than others. And now I will put Jonathan on the spot to give us some of the legal framework of how this can be viewed differently in terms of, okay, you have a hypothetical condominium association. Let's say they have a few direct employees, you know, so the association, Jonathan, is an employer with a few employees. You know, what are the guiding principles of that?
Well, just to speak generally and not to get caught in the web of the minutia, when the first question is, we're looking at employer-employee, right? And this also affects, you know, the different vendors and their own employees, like, for example, management and its employees. And so when we look at whether an employer can require an employee to get vaccinated, I speak cautiously, but the general rule in Florida is, as an at-will employment state, yes, there's been guidance that employers could require vaccination for employees, subject to some important caveats. The first important caveat is that it can't be mandatory when somebody has a medical reason for not getting the vaccine, when somebody has a reason for not getting the vaccine that's protected by the Civil Rights Act, such as like a religious reason, some sort of disability. So that's very important. Okay, so that's a huge exception. Also, there are some questions as to whether the nature of the approval of these vaccines affects this general guidance. So like there's general guidance that you can require employees to do this, but in this case, these vaccines didn't go through a normal FDA approval process. They got pushed through under an emergency approval process. That may affect, whether you can require it. I'm not here to say it does or doesn't. I'm just here to say it's an issue that, an employer needs to deal with their counsel. From the association standpoint, you look carefully at that. You generally have the right. You look at a case by case of whether you want to require it and how practical it is to, determine whether the exceptions apply. And then, of course, there's, general business judgment and practicality of, what kind of issues is this going to cause from an operational standpoint to require employees to get vaccinated, right? Or to, and of course, there's a separate question then we'll pivot to dealing with the vendors of the association, whether we're going to require the vendors to have their employees be vaccinated, right? So as far as associations, as employers, it's an issue to deal with counsel.
Yeah, I think the more interesting one, this involves the management a lot more. In the manager role, management company role, you often have, you're sort of the board's point person for vendors, the valet company, maintenance company, cleaning crew, different things like that. So, Rafael, are you seeing anything with, starting the conversation with, the vendors that the buildings are using, or anything to that extent?
So at the moment, again, I've only had one client that's asking some of these questions. That's very forward thinking, to be 100% frank. However, some of the challenges that I see, like as they bring up these questions, you start thinking of all the different challenges and okay, is it something that we can entertain? So I'll speak to what we're dealing with today, right? And it may not be purely association related, but it is because we're in this business where we're dealing with so many different vendors, we're dealing with so many different kinds of organizations. So some of the questions that you have to ask yourself as a board member, if this is the route that you want to take, where maybe you'd say, we want our vendors to be vaccinated, or we want the management company's employees to be vaccinated. So, it's so early on that it's difficult because there's going to be impacts by making this particular mandate. Number one, we're even though unemployment numbers are still a bit high, and even though we're kind of, I truly don't believe we have the real unemployment numbers yet, depending what you look at. If you look at UC3, UC6, but either way, making these requirements, it's going to change certain things because you have organizations that are privately held. Let's say yesterday we kind of used a plumbing example that may decide I don't want to do it, and then you're limiting the prospects of companies that you may allow within your community. So it's not to say that you shouldn't have the conversation. It's more to say that you have to think about these things when you're going to pass these rules. No different than let's take the vaccine out of the picture, no different when you're passing any other rule. You want to kind of look at the pros and cons before you pass this rule. Because if you do decide, okay, or amend your documents, whichever approach you guys will take that perspective on how to do it, whichever approach you decide, you have to look at both sides of it. Because if you decide to pass this rule, number one, how are you going to enforce it? How are you going to confirm that these individuals have it, have the proper vaccination? So, when you're looking at this, you got to build your pros and cons list, have the discussions with your attorney, with your management partners, and get the conversation going rather than just, making a quick rash decision. No, we want everyone to be vaccinated, because there will be impacts. Again, even though unemployment numbers are high, the market is very tight. It's very tight, especially in the maintenance and janitorial sector. And it'll be very difficult for you to say, hey, we're only going to employ people that have the proper vaccination.
Yeah, it could cause issues of finding qualified individuals and candidates. I'll also say I totally agree with you, Raphael. It is early. We're talking about an issue that is not yet ripe. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a large group of the population that can't even get a vaccine yet. So this is an issue kind of on the horizon, but it's closer than it seems.
Correct.
It's already starting to percolate. The questions are being asked now, but it's good to get ahead of these issues.
100%, Jonathan. It's important to get ahead of it because, again, it'll be easier instead of you're put under pressure at 1 minute by, let's say, the membership. Hey, well, what do you mean you guys didn't think about this? When you're sitting on a board, you're a leader of the association. So you have to be having these kinds of real conversations. And as a point of reference, in doing my research for today's webinar, OSHA does allow employers to require the flu vaccines of certain employees. So this is a conversation that needs to be had because it can come about where it may be a requirement. Certain employers are going to require.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think you had such a great point that can be a practical takeaway for the managers and any directors listening. Start the conversation now at an association or association management to the vendor level. What is your valet company planning on doing? What is your cleaning, if you have a cleaning vendor who's sending people in, what are they planning on doing? Maybe it's going to be a non-issue. Maybe the business community is going to sort of, when you see, like, again, the plumbing example, you see the plumbing truck, it says licensed and insured. Is it going to say licensed, insured, and vaccinated? I don't know. I personally think it could be a marketing point that companies might say, hey, we're going to differentiate. We're going to take this issue off the table. We don't want to deal with it. We're going to get our team vaccinated, and so it's a non-issue. Maybe I'm totally wrong, and it's going to be a huge fight within companies on employee level, which then impacts the vendors you're hiring, because if they don't have the situation handled internally, then so the big takeaway is start the conversation now. Be early on it. Be proactive instead of reactive once the managers are getting bombarded with 20, 30, 40, 50 emails a day from some of their favorite residents that are up in arms about, well, what are we doing? Why don't we think about this? How do we plan it? So you heard it here on April 14th.
Yeah.
And I think that especially applies to the issue of the discussion with existing vendors, right? Like pivoting from employer-employee, you look at the existing vendors you have. You can talk about what you're going to require of future vendors. And a lot of this, right, David, is going to be governed by contract law and what you're going to agree to in your contracts with these vendors. And of course, the practical considerations both of you talked about. But when you're looking at existing vendors, it's never too late. It's never too early to look at what contract you have right now, look at what your existing vendors are doing and asking, well, what are you planning on doing about this? And thinking about what does the contract require? What kind of, maybe there's an opportunity to negotiate some sort of approach to this. Certainly it's worth a conversation with your existing vendors of, are you going to require this? Do you think the governor's order prohibits you from doing that? Do you think that you're going to, are you going to require vaccinations? Are you not going to require vaccination? I think that's definitely something to start talking about with existing service providers.
Correct.
Now to the much more difficult, thorny, challenging bucket, owners and residents. Raphael said he's already hearing rumblings of it via his team and via the community associations they work with. Jonathan and I are already starting to see the discussion at the community association attorney level, and also we're trying to be proactive with our clients on this. Can associations require mandatory vaccination of owners and residents? Jonathan, where are we going with this? What are the problems with this? What are people saying, and where is this whole issue going?
Right. So I'm going to just talk briefly about some general kind of principles that apply to this. The first one I'm going to say is we're going to talk about things. People have to think really hard and practically about the administration of what we're about to talk about. Like, how can you even accomplish these things from in a day in, day out manner, like on the ground? So like we can talk about concepts here, but somebody's going to have to do things in a building or in a community on a day in, day out basis to administer whatever we're talking about. And there's practicalities involved that Raphael will speak to, that you'll speak to, David, that I'll speak to. Second, in general, obviously, we look at this from the standpoint that associations have a business judgment obligation to act reasonably and consult with their professionals, whether it be the lawyers, the managers, looking at public health guidelines. And so that should be like the pole star for this question, right? You want to encourage life safety. So if you're coming from a place that's a good place of wanting to protect people, right? But with that said, how far can you go, right? From a practical standpoint and from a legal standpoint. So first I'm going to talk about this from a legal standpoint. There's a big difference between enacting a declaration amendment approved by the membership that deals with this versus just doing rules, okay? If you do a declaration amendment, first of all, you have buy-in from a significant percentage of the membership. You also have a sort of buy-in from the courts because the courts give a strong presumption of validity to declaration amendments. Declaration amendments are hard to accomplish. And also, it's important to consider that declaration amendments, because they're so hard to do, are like written in stone. So like you don't want to be too specific because it doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility and you need to know how it's going to be implemented. So if you're going to go the declaration amendment route, you're looking at something that's a little more broad that permits the adoption of rules that are more specific, but specifically empowers the association to say, for example, impose restrictions that require certain public health measures, including but not, in accordance with health guidelines, including but not limited to requiring vaccination, if permitted by applicable law, and if and I'm just spitballing, but and as long as no reasonable exception applies, something you come up with a formulation, but it can't be too specific. That provision could still be invalid, arguably, depending on how it's framed and what it tries to accomplish, because there are certain inherent rights in the Condo Act and Florida law for members, for individuals, and so there's a question of the legality of this. And I'll give you one concrete example. As a general fundamental issue, if you're talking about restricting someone's access to their unit or saying, oh, you can't be in the community if you're not vaccinated, which of course is the most extreme example, nobody's suggesting that. That violates the access right to property. It's a major controversial thing to do that could, even if it was in the declaration, there's a significant question of whether that would even be legal because people have easements and access rights to their units and their property, okay? But that's just an extreme example. Alternatively, you could just have a restriction that prohibits access to the pool, and that gets into the legality of that. Now, there's emergency powers that have been enacted by the state of Florida in the statutes, and they give certain powers to restrict access to common elements under certain circumstances, but associations have to proceed with extreme caution in trying to justify like a prohibition on access for not having a vaccine. And this is, of course, putting aside the administrative nightmare of how somebody can prove they're vaccinated, the privacy rights of individuals, the burden not to reveal people's private rights. And now, if you have the rights in the declaration, you can consider a rule. If you don't have the rights in the declaration, there's a significant legal question of whether you even have the power to adopt a rule that requires vaccinations because of what's in the declaration, the easement rights that are there, the fundamental rights that are there. So there's a big question about it. But let's say you try to do it. If you want to adopt the rule, it's got to be reasonable. You got to consult with the professionals. You got to look at the CDC guidelines, right? But so you adopt this rule. It's arguably on, who knows if the legal basis is good. But how do you enforce that rule? is the rule a rule that you
Right,
can't
so
access the
I'm gonna
court
stop
without
you right
proving
there.
vaccination?
Hold on.
You know what I mean? Like,
Enforcement, hold on. Right there, because I see these things and I think, well, how does it work? How would it work practically speaking? What would the impact be on my manager who have to actually deal with this stuff?
right.
Burden with it. So let's just assume for this educational discussion, the community passes a declaration. It's enforceable. You have to be vaccinated. Now they have a guest. They're allowed to have the guest they use. So even assuming, now this is the second big assumption, you've got your, I guess, list of vaccinated residents. Obviously, you don't have a list of vaccinated guests. So immediately you have to deal with this boondoggle of Raphael's guests. Are they vaccinated? Are they not vaccinated? We're creating this quasi bubble that everyone here is vaccinated, but for recognized exceptions. So now what are we doing with the guests? Now the guest is, there's this unclear law, allegedly in Florida, that don't have to show a vaccination passport. So just right there, the basics of this, the whole thing starts to fall apart.
Yeah.
Even taking these huge assumptions that pass a declaration and then we can get the votes, that's enforceable. Your community's on board with it. Just when the first guest comes, what are you supposed to do on a practical level? I don't know. And I think that's going through these thought exercises to me shows what a mess.
No, that'll be David. I mean, look, I'm going to give it a comparison right to the HO6 policies with condos that we had some years ago.
Oh yeah, great example.
And kind of just to flip the script on the whole vaccine is that was its own challenge, right? Trying to get just a simple certificate of insurance for the condos. For those of you that don't know, at one point, the condo association had a requirement to obtain these HO6 policies from those condo owners.
Or could force place them.
Yeah, it made logical sense because it benefits the association if there's a catastrophe. But logistically, it was almost impossible to be able to get it done. So I could see the same exact thing happening with the vaccine. Again, in no way am I saying not to have the conversation, but what I am saying is that you have to keep these things in mind, because now what management, or if you're a self-managed community, now you're going to start managing medical records, for residents. What are now going to be the implications of a records request? If someone says, "Oh, I want a records request of everyone that's been vaccinated," is that going to need to be provided? What are the liabilities behind that? So, it's difficult enough to have to manage the day-to-day. I can't imagine of having to add this to the mix. In Florida, right, we see it in the news all the time where, in Fort Lauderdale recently, we had a burning of masks and everything else that's going on. It's been difficult enough to mandate the mask requirements within our condo associations. With that, I totally agree that is necessary because we need to protect the residents. It's a fiduciary duty of the association. However, if we're having a challenge with people putting on a mask, imagine trying to, hey, show me your vaccine card so I can record it. And you bring a great point, David, with the guests. How are we going to manage that?
Yeah, and just a couple of points. The first one was, like, for example, with the guests, what you're really saying is you need a vaccine passport. You need something to show that you've been vaccinated. And of course, we already talked about the fact that there's a governor's executive order that may or may not prohibit that, right? And a guest may or may not be a patron of the business, the condominium association, which is subject to debate, right? So huge issue. But practically speaking, that's the only way with guests to get some sort of passport or upfront certification or approval. I mean, looking at practically how this would go, right? First, you could have people submit, their proof privately. It would be a private medical record. You couldn't share it. You'd have a list. I mean, realistically, you'd almost have to have a gate access to the amenities that you want to restrict access to, where somebody would have to sit there and have a checklist and you sign in, you're on the list, you can go in. I mean, and that's a huge administrative expense and hassle that you got to disclaim that you're creating a safe environment. You can't lead people to think that, oh, everybody here is vaccinated, because that may not be, so you have to be very clear that you're not assuming some duty or responsibility. Now, I just want to quickly pivot that to liability, because underlying all this, besides everybody's good nature,
Exactly.
is
This
the
is,
fear
I'm
of
glad you're going
liability.
there, because I was going to bring up
Yeah,
the liability protection statute.
right, exactly. So I'll let you bring that up and talk about it, David, but
No, go
underlying this is
Go
this
right ahead.
liability. Go ahead.
right ahead.
Yeah, so just recently, on an emergency basis, the governor signed into law a statute that protects businesses from liability. And the thought is, the thinking right now is that that applies to associations, as a not-for-profit
Now,
corporation.
let's go right to be a little specific, only because I have it right here on the screen. I don't have this memorized. Business entity has the same meaning as provided in section 606.03. The term also includes the charitable organization, as defined in section 496.44, and a corporation not for profit, as defined in section 617.014. So a little bit more specific document than the other.
Yeah, so the statute, it doesn't totally eliminate liability, but it requires clear and convincing evidence, which is a very high standard, of gross negligence. So basically reckless disregard for standards of care and safety. And it's important to put this in the perspective of the emergency orders. If emergency orders require something, well, now totally disregarding that, well, that's a question of whether that's reckless. But if no emergency orders are requiring everybody to get vaccinated. This is not something that is required by anybody. In fact, many people for a while now are going to not be able to get vaccinated. And even at the end, some people will never be able to get some of these vaccines for health reasons and other reasons. So it's not like adherence to reasonable duties of care to protect people requires this at all, right? It is not that high a standard. And so if you, and the requirements to file lawsuits for negligence relating to COVID requires an affidavit from a medical professional that this caused the issue, the health issue or the death. And that's a prerequisite to filing suit. And so the complaint has to be very specific, including the causal link. So it would be very hard, if not almost, I don't want to say impossible, but there are very few circumstances you can think of where an associate, and I'm not here to say it's, you're immune, but it's a very strong protection from liability. So reasonable business judgment can't fall back on, well, we have to protect against liability. That's not really the consideration here, because you can do other things to protect against liability and to protect people's health. Again, I'm not sitting here as an advocate saying, oh, you shouldn't require this or that, because I believe in public safety, and every direct board has to make its own decisions with its own consultations. But I don't think it's necessary by any stretch to require vaccinations or have a restriction. And so that's a critical point.
If I can add to that, I mean, it's important what you mentioned about the liability, even though it's obviously the gross negligence part, but it's still important for those managers and board members that are on the call, that you're following, the guidelines. In no way, and I'm sure Jonathan would agree, in no way is he saying that, hey, let's take a step back based on what you believe is right. Ultimately, you still have a responsibility to protect your residents within your community. So you want to make sure that in bare minimum, you're at least at the basic guidelines that the CDC is providing. Again,
absolutely.
My experience has shown that, board members have been loosening up, staying within the CDC guidelines over the past couple of months. However, you still want to make sure that you're following the basic protocols for your particular community.
Absolutely. And just because there's this liability shield, that really applies to like personal injury. It doesn't mean a member can't sue the association for failing to act with business judgment to protect members. That's a big difference from being sued for wrongful death because somebody died of COVID, which this would arguably protect you from, versus a member saying my association is ignoring the CDC guidelines and creating an unsafe nuisance. They have to be enjoined from doing that, and I'm entitled to this or that. Big difference. So great, it's a very important clarification. And certainly you have to file the minimum guidelines, or it could be recklessness or gross negligence. And you know, you could have people who've been sitting in their property and they haven't been anywhere else. They're not socializing. They're not doing other unsafe activities. If they get COVID and something happens, a doctor might sign an affidavit that says, well, they didn't go anywhere else. And you could be liable. So I thank you for emphasizing that, Raphael.
No problem at all. I mean, think about it. Doctors are still signing the emotional support animal without an issue, even though the new law passed. So who knows?
Don't even get me started.
No, I know. Let's stay on topic.
Let's stay on topic. We're going one more hour. You're getting me riled up now. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm checking my notes here. It looks like we checked all the big boxes, but I wanted to check with Raphael. Did you want to touch on anything else in terms of, you know, at the team level or the management level before we sign off here?
Sure. First and foremost, I wanted to thank you and your team for putting this together, especially, we know we're the ones that look pretty on the screen, but there's two ladies, Maury and Ashley, behind the scenes that do all the work. So I wanted to thank them. Next, really just to the board members and managers that are on the webinar. You know, very appreciative that you're here today, taking the time to gain additional education and knowledge on how to deal with these difficult times and these difficult situations or questions that we have to ask. However, it's important that we ask these questions. You know, this is how we get educated and we make better decisions for our community. You know, if you're not obtaining this knowledge and at least understanding what could be the complications with certain decisions that you make, you're just going to start making harsh, rash decisions that just won't work for your community. So outside of that, thank you again for having me here. It's been an honor, as always, to partner up with you and the firm to do these webinars, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you so much. And Jonathan, I'll let you add anything at the end. And I checked the chat here. I don't know if we have the capability or time for it, but please don't hesitate. You can submit questions. Jay Goldstein at haber.law or decoding, CODEIN at haber.law. Probably the best way to get a hold of us. And you know, we'd love to continue the conversation and help with any questions. Obviously, we can't give specific actionable legal advice on clients, but we certainly can have consultations or further discussions about this type of thing. Jonathan, why don't you wrap us up?
Sure, I'd like to join David and Raphael in thanking everyone for attending. You know, thank you, Raphael, and your team and managers for being on the front lines and being essential workers throughout this crisis. And it should not go unnoticed. And even now, you know, you're here to, you know, impart knowledge to directors and management and other people in condos. So thank you for that. It's it's a real service, and it should be appreciated as such. And similar, you know, thank you to our team members, to the Affinity team members, you know, who helped us put this together. And of course, thank you to the directors and members for, you know, being curious enough and wanting to know more. You know, again, it's in furtherance of public safety. And so I wish everybody safety. And I'm getting my second vaccine today, as a matter of fact. I'm going this afternoon. So, you know, I'm not here to get political or make any public service announcements. But of course, you know, we do encourage vaccination for those who can get it. And thank you for attending. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Raphael.
Pleasure. Thank you, guys.